In 1911, RMS Olympic returns to Belfast, not as a triumph, but as an expensive problem. The collision with the cruiser HMS Hawke tore away steel plates, warped internal structures, and set off alarms inside the White Star Line. As the wounded hull slides into dry dock, right beside it, Titanic is still rising in silence, seemingly untouched. Documents and eyewitness accounts suggest that from this point on, quiet decisions will directly link the fate of these two ships. If you want to follow this investigation all the way to the end, stay with this video and consider subscribing so you do not miss what was decided inside the shipyard in 1911. In 1911, the docks of Belfast receive Olympic as an urgent case, not as a showpiece liner. The early return disrupts schedules, diverts resources, and puts the shipyard on high alert. The collision with HMS Hawke has already made headlines, but here the impact is measured in work hours, steel, and money. Every foot of hull that rolls into the dry dock means more cost and more pressure on the technical team. Right next to it, Titanic remains still, but its future is already being shaped by this repair. From this moment on, every decision made for Olympic will directly affect Titanic's day-to-day construction. With the dock almost dry, the most revealing phase begins: the detailed inspection of the hull. Engineers and foremen walk every damaged section, measuring deformations and logging numbers into technical reports. The scars from the collision with HMS Hawke appear as bent plates, sheared rivets, and misaligned joints. Each measurement tells them how much steel must be cut out, reinforced, or replaced, and how long Olympic will stay out of service. At the same time, those figures fuel debates about the Olympic-class design as a whole. What they learn down here, under this hull, will also be taken into account when Titanic is finished. With the hull safely supported, attention shifts to Olympic's interior. Corridors once meant for passengers now receive engineers, flashlights, and clipboards. The deformations that started on the hull show up as uneven floors, doors that will not close, and stressed internal structures. Technicians check whether the watertight compartments behave the way the blueprints promised during the impact. In some areas, the damage is only skin deep. In others, it points to the need for reinforcements that were never in the original plans. These observations will drive both immediate repairs and future decisions for the entire Olympic class. While damage is being measured inside the dry dock, the shipyard offices come under a different kind of pressure. Typewriters hammer non-stop, turning out technical reports, cost estimates, and revised timelines. Every typed page represents hours of repair work and extra days with Olympic out of service. Telegrams go out to the White Star Line with updates on the extent of the damage and the need for fast decisions. Evidence gathered on the hull is now translated into numbers, tables, and formal material requests. It is in this administrative environment that the collision turns into financial impact and schedule changes that also reach Titanic. While Olympic is being measured and remarked in the dry dock, Titanic is rising just a few yards away, on blocks and scaffolding. The two ships belong to the same class. They share design principles and many structural components. Engineers look at Olympic's damaged hull and inevitably think about how this extra effort echoes in the ships still under construction. The original schedule assumed Olympic would be in steady service and Titanic would move forward without interruptions. The collision breaks that logic. Parts, teams, and deadlines are now evaluated together as a single system. From this point on, the yard is not just managing two ships, but a direct relationship between them. Inside the assembly sheds, Olympic's collision shows up as longer and longer material lists. Supervisors review stockpiles of plates, rivets, and internal reinforcements, calculating what the repair will consume. Workers notice that extra orders are piling up, and the usual flow of parts is no longer being followed. Some components originally planned for Titanic start being considered for immediate use on Olympic, even if that is never formally written down. The evidence suggests the yard is starting to work on the edge between what it has in stock and what is still on the way. In that environment, urgency becomes visible and feeds quiet comments about the real impact of the accident on the construction routine. With materials already on the way, technicians return to Olympic's hull with a different mindset. Now, the goal is not just to record what was bent, but to understand how far the impact traveled through the structure. Engineers test internal reinforcements, measure deflection in the longitudinals, and listen to the metal's response to small controlled hammer blows. In some spots, the hollow sound tells them the stress went further than the first report suggested. The evidence shows this repair will demand more than simply swapping out outer plates. That means more steel, more labor hours, and a higher chance of interfering with Titanic's schedule, which depends on the same resources. As the diagnosis progresses, the numbers begin to worry them as much as the twisted metal. Reports now call for more steel, more work hours, and more dock time than anyone expected right after the collision. For the White Star Line, every day with Olympic laid up means a lost revenue and uncomfortable questions from shareholders and authorities. Shipyard engineers and company managers now debate not just the repair, but its impact on the budget for the entire class, Titanic included. The evidence suggests choices will have to be made about where to focus resources, and that makes Titanic's schedule part of the problem. Cost considerations start to weigh just as heavily as the technical decisions made inside the dry dock. With costs climbing, the top priority becomes getting Olympic back into service as fast as possible. Material orders for the repair move faster than the stock can be replenished. Component lists originally drawn up for Titanic start to appear on requisitions tied to Olympic. Some crates leave the warehouse with one destination on paper and reach the yard with another, adjusted on the fly. Officially, everything is logged as reallocating resources inside the shipyard. On the shop floor, though, it is clear that parts planned for a ship under construction are being used to save the ship that is already damaged. As Olympic's repair moves forward, some of Titanic's planned parts stop being just numbers on a list and physically cross the yard toward the dry dock. Internal reinforcements, plates, and structural components begin to move from a hull still being built to one that is already torn open. For the yard, it is a practical solution. One idle ship brings immediate losses, the other has not sailed yet. The paperwork calls it resource reallocation, but anyone looking around can see Titanic is quietly paying the bill for Olympic's accident. If you want to find out how far these decisions went and what they may have cost, keep watching and consider subscribing to follow this entire historical investigation. As the repair advances, the shipyard starts working under artificial light as well. Shifts stretch into the night, with teams rotating between Olympic's damaged hull and Titanic's construction. Floodlights, lamps, and handheld lanterns light up specific work zones, while corridors and passageways stay in the shadows. Timesheets show long hours piling up at an intense pace, with barely any break between one shift and the next. Historians and archaeologists who study this period point out how deadline pressure raises the risk of fatigue and error. In that setting, every piece installed, removed, or reinforced depends on the judgment of professionals already working at their physical limit. With the repair underway, the original drawings stop being fixed documents and turn into work in progress. Engineers cross things out, layer new sheets over old ones, and create updated versions to track the changes made to Olympic. Some solutions used on the damaged ship are also considered for Titanic, which still allows modifications before completion. Plans for the Olympic class begin to show layers of corrections, dates, and successive technical notes. The evidence makes it clear the design is not static. It is reacting to the collision and to hands-on experience in the dry dock. This ongoing adjustment process shows how decisions made under pressure can shape the final form of both ships. With the diagnosis complete, Olympic's repair stops being just a technical matter and starts demanding formal decisions. Reports showed that the damaged areas will need extra reinforcements and a broader reallocation of materials. In practice, that means authorizing design changes, shifting resources, and accepting indirect delays in Titanic's schedule. Meetings between the shipyard and the White Star Line define which emergency modifications will be carried out and which will be postponed. The evidence suggests many of those calls are based on cost and time as much as on structural safety. The documents signed at this stage formalize a direct link between Olympic's accident and the conditions under which Titanic will be finished. With the emergency modifications approved, the pace inside the dry dock ramps up. Teams work on multiple sections of Olympic at the same time, cutting away damaged parts and installing new reinforcements. Some components come straight from Titanic's areas, shrinking the gap between a decision on paper and its application on the hull. Supervisors juggle work fronts so cranes, rivet gangs, and plates are never left idle. Records show a clear jump in daily output, along with longer shifts and very little room for lengthy reviews. While Titanic keeps rising next door, Olympic's accelerated repair starts to consume more and more of the yard's attention and resources. As the yard speeds up the repair, Olympic's accident also becomes the subject of official reports. Maritime authorities and representatives of the British Navy request documents, diagrams, and statements from officers involved in the collision with HMS Hawke. In the offices, what was once just a technical and financial headache now takes on the shape of operational responsibility. Records compare maneuvers, distances, and sailing conditions at the moment of impact. These inquiries are not about Titanic directly, but they influence how the Olympic class is viewed in terms of safety. The evidence gathered here helps define which adjustments are considered enough and which will remain points of historical debate. With the decisions signed off, the focus returns to Olympic's hull to see if the new reinforcements meet the requirements. Teams test the watertight integrity of compartments, measure leftover deformation, and evaluate how the new structures behave. For each completed section, engineers log results and reports comparing the current condition with the state right after the collision. Some compartments are subjected to extra tests with water and pressure, simulating harsher stress scenarios. The data clearly shows improvement over the initial damage, but also reveals limits in the class's original design. These tests help define what is good enough for Olympic to return to service and what will simply be watched on Titanic as a future point of concern. With most of the reinforcements in place, Olympic is prepared to leave the dry dock. Scaffolding comes down, tools are packed away, and final tests confirm that critical areas meet the standards of the time. Engineers polish their final reports, comparing the ship's current state with its condition immediately after the collision with HMS Hawke. For the White Star Line, it means the source of direct losses is close to earning money again. For the yard, freeing the dock also means it can shift crews and materials back toward Titanic. From this point on, Olympic and Titanic move along parallel tracks. One returns to service, the other heads into its final construction phase, both marked by the decisions made in 1911. As the dock floods, Olympic gets ready to float again after weeks of intense repairs. Crews check mooring lines, draft readings, and last-minute corrections before the gate is fully opened. For the White Star Line, this moment marks the end of the immediate financial blow tied to the collision with HMS Hawke. Inside the yard, though, eyes are already turning back to Titanic, which must now push through its final construction stage. The evidence suggests that part of the know-how gained repairing Olympic will be used selectively on the ship being finished. From here, the two move in parallel. One returns to active duty, the other heads toward its maiden voyage, both tied to choices made on these same docks. With Olympic out of the dock, the yard once again centers its routine on Titanic. For many workers, however, the two ships remain connected by the weeks in which parts, reinforcements, and attention were shared. Empty crates, chalk marks, and English labels around the yard remind them that materials originally meant for Titanic were used in Olympic's emergency repair. Accounts from those who worked in the dry dock in 1911 describe this practical resource shuffle as part of everyday life, not as a grand conspiracy. From the engineers' and workers' perspective, the priority was to keep one ship in service and finish the other within acceptable time and cost. Today, any close look at Titanic has to factor in that prior context, where Olympic's accident quietly shaped decisions made right next door. With Olympic back in service, the yard throws its full weight behind finishing Titanic. The main structure is complete, and the work now focuses on compartments, watertight doors, and interior fit-out. Some reinforcements and design tweaks directly reflect what was observed during Olympic's repair months earlier. Engineers once again check critical structural points, while fitting-out teams move ahead in the passenger areas. Titanic's drawings now carry extra notes compared to the earliest versions, but the schedule still demands a firm pace up to launch. From this stage on, the ship stops being just a hull under construction and starts to look like the vessel the world will remember. With the main structure completed, Titanic nears the moment it will finally touch the sea. The hull, still without fully finished interiors, will be moved off the building blocks and down to the fitting out berth, where the final work will be done. Inside the yard, this is treated as just another technical step, but the ship's sheer size draws everyone's attention. Engineers run through checklists tied to the hull, keel, and basic systems before the operation begins. Many of the reinforcements and structural choices now built into the ship reflect exactly what was learned from Olympic's repair. From here on, Titanic takes over the physical and symbolic place that once belonged to her sister ship, now already back in service. The moment comes when Titanic leaves the building cradle and touches open water for the first time. The operation is carefully controlled by cables, brakes, and teams stationed on different levels of the slipway. Technically, it is the transfer of the hull to the fitting out berth, but the scale of the ship makes it a stunning sight. Engineers trust their calculations on weight, friction, and stopping power, many of them refined using the experience gained with Olympic. As the hull picks up speed and nears the water, the entire yard watches in focused silence. When Titanic finally floats, she takes the place in the harbor that Olympic once held, symbolically closing the cycle started by the 1911 collision. With Titanic's hull now alongside the pier, work enters the fitting out and in-water adjustment phase. Teams operate at the same time on decks, interiors, and technical spaces, connecting systems that until now existed only on paper. Engineers check shaft alignment, rudder position, and how watertight compartments tie into pumps and valves. Some procedures follow the class standard to the letter. Others include tweaks inspired by the recent experience with Olympic. English checklists record which items have been tested, reviewed, or are still waiting for additional inspection. At this point, the ship is almost in her final form, but she still carries the imprint of technical choices made throughout 1911, after Olympic's collision. With Titanic alongside and powered up, formal inspections and mandatory certifications begin. Representatives from the yard, the White Star Line, and the Board of Trade move through the ship carrying detailed English checklists, inspecting technical and safety items. Documents record capacities, watertight subdivision, emergency equipment, and the overall condition of the hull. Part of these standards was tightened after Olympic's accident, which showed how the class structure behaved in a real-world collision. The notes flag approved points, areas to monitor, and tests still pending, especially around pumps, watertight doors, and lifeboats. Once the forms are signed, Titanic receives on paper confirmation that she is ready to operate by the standards of her time. With certificates issued and tests completed, Titanic is prepared to leave Belfast and enter her operational phase. At the fitting out berth, cargo, coal, and provisions are arranged according to detailed English loading lists, aligned with the voyage plan. Engineers review final reports, confirming that the changes introduced after Olympic's repair are now fully built into the ship. For the yard, Titanic represents the continuation of the same class, now adjusted by the lessons from the 1911 collision. The daily log records dates, capacities, and compliance with Board of Trade standards, without any hint of what will happen on later voyages. When the ship finally pulls away from the pier, those who worked on both sisters see the technical closing of a process that began with Olympic's impact and ends with Titanic ready for service. With preparations complete, Titanic slowly moves away from the Belfast Pier for the first time. Tugs at the bow and stern control the opening maneuver while the shipyard watches the result of years of design and months of adjustments slide past. In the records, the liner appears as the natural continuation of the class that began with Olympic, now carrying reinforcements and modifications born from the 1911 collision. The reports showed deadlines met, certificates issued, and technical requirements satisfied according to the standards of the day. Later, investigators and historians will come back to these documents to understand how decisions made after Olympic's accident influenced Titanic. On that day, though, the only thing officially recorded was the departure of a brand new ocean liner, leaving behind the yard that quietly bound the stories of the two ships together.